My name is Luciana Reyes. I am 31 years old, and I used to believe that the people who watched you build something from nothing would eventually stop acting like the nothing was still what you were. I was wrong. I know that now because of a single printed page I carried folded in my jacket pocket to a party, and what happened when I set it on a bar in front of the person who had spent 2 years being certain I wasn't capable of it. I started Reyes Meridian Staffing Solutions out of a spare bedroom in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, when I was 24 years old. The bedroom had one window that faced a parking structure, a folding table I had bought secondhand for $18, and a laptop that took 4 minutes to boot. I had no investors, no co-founder, no safety net of any kind. What I had was 7 years of watching my father, a man named Gustavo Reyes, who had come to the United States from Jalisco when he was 19 and spent the next 3 decades working in distribution warehouses, get passed over for every promotion he was qualified for because he did not have the right name or the right face or the right accent in the right room. I had decided, at some point I could not pinpoint exactly, that the most useful thing I could build was the room itself. I did not talk about the business much at family gatherings. My extended family had a particular way of understanding work organized around visibility. My father's work was real: warehouse, distribution, logistics. My uncle Bernardo's work was real: plumbing contractor, had a truck with his name on it. My cousin Sophia, 28, a nursing degree, the family's designated success story. I respected that genuinely. My work existed somewhere in the category of things that might eventually become something. She has a little business, I heard my Aunt Cecilia say once. Hiring people or something. I had been running a 7-figure operation for 14 months. If you've ever sat at a table full of people who love you and realize they have a version of you in their heads that is years behind the actual one, stay with me. Because what I'm about to tell you is what happens when that gap finally closes in the wrong room. Reyes Meridian placed mid-level operations and logistics professionals, the exact tier my father had spent his career stuck inside, into companies that were growing fast enough to need them immediately. I knew what those candidates looked like on paper, how they were screened out, and what the companies screening them were actually missing. I charged full market rate for every placement and I delivered candidates who stayed, which in the staffing industry is the only metric that compounds over time. By the end of my second year I had placed 43 candidates with 11 client companies and achieved a 12-month retention rate of 88%, which was 19 points above the industry average for my placement tier. By my 4th year I had 5 full-time employees, a real office on the 4th floor of a building in the Short North neighborhood, and a client list that included 3 regional distribution companies, a national logistics firm, and a mid-sized manufacturing operation outside Dayton that had come to me after their previous staffing agency's retention rate collapsed. The pattern had a face by the time Sophia brought home Diego Fuentes. Diego arrived at Easter dinner that year. I was 29, with the particular confidence of a man who had recently been told by multiple sources that he was exceptional. He was 33, good-looking in a way he was clearly aware of, and worked in business development for a mid-sized pharmaceutical company in Cincinnati. He drove a leased BMW and mentioned it within the first 20 minutes, not directly but through the specific route of explaining why he had taken the highway instead of surface streets. The car handles better at speed, which was its own kind of announcement. Sophia introduced us in the kitchen while my Aunt Cecilia was stirring the rice. Diego shook my hand with the calibrated warmth of someone who had done a sales training module on first impressions and remembered the key points. Sophia tells me you do something with hiring, he said. Staffing, I said. I run a placement firm. Oh, like a temp agency? Mid-level permanent placement. Operations and logistics. He nodded the way people nod when they have received information and decided it does not require updating their original assessment. Good for you, he said. It's a tough market for small businesses right now. I looked at him for a moment. It is, I said. We've managed to grow despite it, placed 43 candidates in the last 12 months alone. He smiled politely. Well, persistence is everything, right? He reached past me for the serving spoon. How long have you been at it? Going on 6 years now, I said. Impressive, he said. He said it the way people say impressive when they mean fine. I'll keep my fingers crossed for you. I turned back to the counter. Thank you, I said. That was the first one. Small, precise, delivered with the warmth of someone who believed he was being encouraging. I filed it and moved on. The second incident happened 6 weeks later, at my parents' house on a Sunday. Sofia and Diego had come for dinner. They had been together 4 months, and he was becoming a fixture at family meals with the comfortable speed of a man who had decided this was a good situation and intended to consolidate it. My father had made birria. The table was full. Diego was telling a story about a deal his company had closed, significant revenue, significant territory expansion, and my Uncle Bernardo was listening with the respectful attention that men in my family gave to other men who described their work in large terms. I had just returned from a week in Chicago where I had closed a contract with a regional cold chain logistics company, my largest single client agreement to date, a 2-year retainer that would bring in just under $400,000 annually. I had not mentioned it at the table because it had not come up. Then my mother asked me, in the way mothers ask things at full tables when they want to redirect the conversation towards someone who has been quiet, "Mija, how is the business? Anything new?" Before I could answer, Diego looked up from his plate and said, with a smile that was completely sincere, "She's building it up. You have to be patient with these things. Rome wasn't built in a day, right, Luciana?" The table moved on. Sofia laughed lightly. My father met my eyes for exactly 1 second across the table and then looked down at his bowl. I folded my napkin into a smaller square and said nothing. Later, in the kitchen, while I was helping my mother wrap the leftovers, she said quietly, not unkindly, just factually, the way she said most things, "He means well. He just doesn't know." "I know he doesn't know," I said. "Maybe tell him more. About what you do." I pressed the lid onto the container. "Mom," I said, "I've told this family what I do for 6 years. At some point that stops being my job to repeat." She looked at me for a moment, and then she nodded, once the way she nodded when she agreed with something she wasn't sure she was supposed to agree with. I handed her the container and we finished the kitchen in comfortable quiet. What I understood by then was that Diego's particular variety of condescension was not hostile. That was the thing that made it so difficult to name in a room full of people who loved each other. He did not dislike me. He simply had a hierarchy in his head, one organized around visible credentials and legible titles and the specific kind of confidence that comes from working inside a large institution with a recognizable name. And he had placed me somewhere near the bottom of it without malice, the way you place a piece of furniture in a room without considering whether the furniture has an opinion about the arrangement. He would figure out his error eventually, I thought. The question was what it would take. What I want to describe now is not a single moment but a shape, the shape that 5 years of building something serious makes when nobody in your immediate world has updated their picture of you. It started before Diego. It started, really, the day I filed the LLC paperwork and called my father to tell him. He had been quiet on the phone for a moment and then said, not without warmth, not without love, but with the honest uncertainty of a man who had spent his whole life inside institutions and could not quite picture what it looked like to build one. "Mija, you are sure about this? It is very hard to find clients when nobody knows your name." "Then I'll make them know it," I said. He had laughed and I had laughed too, and that was the end of it. But I carried the question with me for years because it was the right question. It was exactly the question I had to answer, and the answering of it was the whole work. The first year I answered it by calling every operations director I had ever spoken to through 6 years of working for other people. 2 years at a regional staffing agency where I had learned the mechanics, 4 years at a mid-sized logistics company where I had been the internal recruiter and had developed a placement methodology that nobody above me had been interested in formalizing. I had 41 contacts in my phone. I called 38 of them in the first 6 weeks. 11 took meetings. 4 became clients. I ran payroll from a spreadsheet for 8 months before I could afford accounting software. I answered my own phones until month 11. I drove to Dayton twice in 1 week during a placement crunch when a client needed 3 operations supervisors filled before the end of a fiscal quarter, because the candidate I needed to close lived in Dayton and preferred to meet in person, and I was not going to lose the placement over a 2-hour drive. By the end of year 2, I had built a candidate pipeline of 412 vetted professionals across 6 metro areas. I had developed a proprietary intake process, I called it the Reyes assessment, that evaluated candidates on operational competency, cultural adaptability, and retention risk simultaneously, which allowed me to reduce the average time to fill for my clients from 63 days to 31. I had put that process into a 12-page document and had 3 of my clients reference it by name in their internal HR communications. During that same period at family gatherings, I was still Luciana with the little business. The second thing I remember from those years was a specific Sunday, maybe 18 months into the company, sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table in the house she had lived in since 1987, eating pan dulce and listening to my Uncle Bernardo explain to my cousin Marcos why it was important to have a trade. "You can always work," Bernardo said. "Nobody can take a skill out of your hands." Marcos was 19 and had just enrolled in an HVAC certification program, and Bernardo was proud, and the conversation was entirely reasonable and good. Then Bernardo looked at me, kindly not critically, and said, "You should have a backup, Luciana. Just in case the business thing doesn't work out. Something real you can fall back on." I had, at that point, placed 107 candidates, retained 4 full-time employees, and was 3 weeks away from signing the short North office lease. I looked at my pan dulce. I broke a small piece off the edge and set it on the plate before I answered. "I appreciate that," I said. He nodded, satisfied. The conversation moved on. What I did not say was, I have placed 107 people into jobs that matched their actual skill level and paid them what they were worth, and most of them had been overlooked before they came to me, and that is a real skill that I built from nothing, and it is not going to stop working. I did not say it because I had learned by then that saying it didn't change anything. The update had to come from evidence, not from me describing the evidence. The family's picture of me was going to shift only when the picture became impossible to maintain. I was patient about that, the way I was patient about most things, the way I had learned to be patient from watching my father spend 30 years in rooms that would not promote him, and deciding that the answer was not patience but a different room entirely. The third memory from those years was Diego, specifically, 8 months into his relationship with Sofia, at a 4th of July cookout at my Aunt Cecilia's house in Westerville. He had been talking to my cousin Andres about his company's hiring process, incredibly rigorous, they only take the top tier, most people don't make it past the first round, and I had been standing nearby, half listening, eating from a plate of food. "Do you know anyone in pharma?" Andres asked him. "My buddy is looking." "Tell him to apply," Diego said. "But honestly, it's a tough interview to crack. They'd never let in someone without the background." He glanced at me, not unkindly, just including me in the conversation the way you include someone standing nearby. "No offense, Luciana, it's just not really a staffing agency kind of thing. They do all their own sourcing." I looked at him. "None taken," I said. "What does the role require?" He described it, director-level, strategic partnerships, specific industry experience. As he talked, I recognized the requirements clearly. They'd probably be open to candidates who came through a specialized firm if the retention record was there, I said. That's usually how these searches land when internal sourcing stalls. Diego smiled. "Maybe." He tilted his head slightly. "Although honestly, for something at this level you'd want a firm with institutional credibility. Not everyone can get their calls returned." "Noted," I said. And I went back to my food because it was July and the corn was good, and I had a meeting Monday morning that was going to change the shape of the next 12 months of my company. What I had done across those years, the inventory, the actual record, the thing nobody in that backyard was tracking. I had sourced and placed 193 mid-level operations professionals across 14 client companies in 5 years. I had achieved an average 12-month retention rate of 87%, sustained across every placement cohort. I had grown revenue from zero to just over $1.3 million annually by year 5, entirely without outside capital. I had built the Reyes assessment into a placement methodology that 2 of my clients had asked to license for their internal HR teams, which I had declined because I was not interested in selling the methodology, I was interested in being the only firm that used it. I had done all of this while Diego Fuentes was telling my cousin Andres that they'd never let in someone without the background. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in September, 3 weeks after the 4th of July cookout. I was at my desk in the short North office, 4th floor, east-facing windows, the morning light coming in flat and clean off the buildings across the street. I had 2 placement files open and a recruiting call scheduled at 10. My office manager, a sharp 26-year-old named Priya who had been with me for 2 years and anticipated most problems before I had to name them, knocked once and came in. "You have a message from Pharaoh Kinsley," she said. "Acquisition inquiry, routed through the contact form. They want a call this week." I looked up. Pharaoh Kinsley Group was a national human capital consulting firm headquartered in Chicago with regional operations in 8 cities. They were not a staffing agency. They were the tier above staffing, strategic workforce consulting, executive search, DEI placement infrastructure. Their Columbus regional director had been quoted in a trade publication I read every month. They did not, as a rule, acquire small independent placement firms. Forward me the message, I said. Priya forwarded it. I read it twice. It was brief and professional and came from Farrow Kinsley's VP of Strategic Acquisitions, a woman named Sandra Okafor. The substance was, they had been tracking our retention metrics for 18 months through industry data aggregators, they found the Reyes assessment methodology interesting, and they wanted to explore whether there was a basis for a conversation about acquisition or strategic partnership. 18 months. They had been watching for 18 months without my knowing it. I called Sandra Okafor that afternoon. The call lasted 40 minutes. She asked precise, substantive questions about the assessment methodology, our candidate pipeline depth, and our client retention architecture. I answered all of them directly. At the end of the call, she said, "We'd like to bring you to Chicago for a formal presentation. We're considering 3 firms in the Midwest corridor and we want to make a decision before the end of Q4. I said I would be available. I did not tell my family. I did not tell Sophia. I did not obviously tell Diego. What I did instead was spend the next 3 weeks preparing the most comprehensive business presentation I had ever assembled, revenue history, placement data, retention cohort analysis, the full Reyes assessment documentation, a 5-year growth projection built on 2 scenarios. I worked on it every morning from 6 to 8 before the rest of the office arrived. Priya knew something significant was happening because I was drinking more coffee than usual and had started leaving the building for 20-minute walks in the afternoon, which I only did when I was processing something that required physical movement to think through clearly. The Chicago meeting was scheduled for a Friday in October. The week before it, Sophia called to tell me she and Diego were engaged. I said the right things. I was happy for her, genuinely, not performed. Sophia was good and she deserved to be happy, and whatever I thought about Diego Fuentes, my cousin's happiness was not something I was going to make complicated. The engagement dinner was scheduled for the following Saturday, 1 week before my Chicago presentation. I almost didn't go. Not because of Diego, because I had 17 things to prepare and the dinner would take the better part of an evening and I was running on a schedule that had no slack in it. But my mother called and said, "Mija, please just come for dinner, it's Sophia," and I went because it was Sophia. I arrived at my Aunt Cecilia's house at 6:30. The table was loud and full and there was champagne, which my family almost never had, and Sophia was glowing with the particular brightness of someone whose life has just reorganized itself around a thing they wanted. I hugged her for a long time and told her she looked beautiful, and she did. Diego was holding court at the end of the table. He had been telling the story of the proposal, rooftop restaurant, the whole thing. She had no idea, and the table was delighted. Then my uncle Bernardo asked Diego about work, because Bernardo asked everyone about work the way other people asked about the weather, and Diego set down his champagne glass and leaned back in his chair with the comfortable authority of a man who had been waiting for this prompt. "Actually, big news on that front," Diego said. "We're expanding the Columbus office significantly. They're looking to bring on a director of strategic partnerships. The interview process is serious. I've been helping vet some of the candidates internally." He looked around the table, including everyone, including me. "I'll be honest, it's a difficult process. They only hire a specific caliber of person. You have to have a real track record, real institutional backing. It's not the kind of role that just anyone walks into." Andres asked what the salary range was. Diego named a number, base plus bonus, probably clears 280, 290 for the right person, and the table made the sounds tables make when a number like that enters a room. Then Diego looked at me with the warm, vaguely pitying expression he had been refining for 18 months and said, "I could put in a word for you if you ever wanted to explore something more stable, Luciana. I know the small business thing is what you know, but a role like this, the exposure, the resources, it's a different world. You'd probably never get into something like this on your own, but with a referral it might be possible." The table did not go quiet. The table kept going, the way tables do, because nobody else had heard what I had heard inside those words. I set my fork down on the edge of my plate. I looked at Diego Fuentes across the table. His expression was completely, genuinely kind, the kindness of someone who believed they were offering something valuable to a person who needed it. My chest was very still. I said, "That's interesting, Diego. Tell me more about the company." He told me. He was happy to tell me. He described the organizational structure, the growth strategy, the regional expansion, the caliber of the leadership team. He was thorough and knowledgeable and spoke with the authority of an insider, which he was in the way that a person who works for a company is always an insider to that company. When he finished, I looked at him for a moment. "Which firm is handling the director search?" I asked. He named it without hesitating. It was not my firm. But the firm he named had sent me a referral inquiry 6 weeks ago about a search in exactly this tier that they had not been able to fill internally, and I had passed on it because I was preparing for Chicago. I nodded slowly. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. And I picked up my fork and I finished my dinner and I let the evening continue. But I had already made the decision. Not the one about what to say to Diego, that was simple and would take 30 seconds when the moment came. The decision I had made was about what I was going to bring to Chicago and how I was going to walk into that room and what I was going to show Sandra Okafor about what a firm looks like when it is built by someone who had spent 6 years being underestimated by exactly this quality of person. The Chicago presentation was on a Friday. I was back in Columbus by 7 that evening, and by the time I walked into my apartment I had a follow-up email from Sandra Okafor already sitting in my inbox. She did not make people wait. The email said that Farrow Kinsley wanted to move forward, that their preferred structure was a full acquisition with a 3-year earnout tied to retention metrics, the exact metrics I had built the company around, and that she would have a term sheet to me by the following Thursday. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop and made dinner and went to sleep at 9:30, which was the most useful thing I could do. The engagement party was the following Saturday. Sophia had wanted something small, 30 people at a restaurant in the short north, the kind of place with exposed brick and a long communal table and a fixed menu that made everyone eat the same thing and talk to each other. I arrived on time, which in my family meant I was one of the first people there. Diego was already at the bar. He had a drink in his hand and the expansive posture of a man who was the occasion, which tonight he was. He waved me over with the easy warmth he had for everyone, and I went, because there was no reason not to. "Luciana," he said. "I'm glad you came. Sophia was worried you might be too busy with work." "I made time," I said. "Good." He nodded approvingly. "You have to protect the personal stuff, right? Business will always be there." He swirled his drink. "Actually, I put in that word for you. With my HR director. About the director role I mentioned at dinner. She said she'd take a look if you wanted to send something over." I looked at him. "That's thoughtful," I said. "It's nothing. You'd have to get through the process like everyone else. I can't do more than get your name in the room. But it's a start." He tilted his head slightly. "Have you thought any more about it? I know the small business life is comfortable, but the upside in a corporate role at our level, the stability alone is worth considering." I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I had brought one document, a single printed page folded in thirds, the way you fold something you intend to hand to someone. I produced it and placed it on the bar between us. He looked at it without picking it up. "What's this?" "The term sheet," I said. "Or the summary of it. The full document is 42 pages. He picked it up and unfolded it. I watched him read the header, Farrow Kinsley Group, Letter of Intent, Acquisition of Reyes Meridian Staffing Solutions, and then his eyes moved to the number in the second paragraph, which was the proposed acquisition price, which was $4.7 million with an earn-out provision that could bring the total to $6.1 million over 3 years contingent on retention performance. He read it twice. I could tell because his eyes moved back to the top of the page after the first pass. "This is," he said. "A national human capital consulting firm," I said. "Headquartered in Chicago. 8 regional offices. They've been tracking our retention metrics for 18 months. They're acquiring us because of a methodology I built. The Reyes assessment. You can look them up, Farrow Kinsley Group. They're well regarded in the space." Diego set the page down on the bar. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, not the warm condescension, not the managerial encouragement, but something unguarded and recalibrating, like a man who has walked confidently into a room and found that the floor is in a different place than he expected. "You're selling the company," he said. "I'm considering it," I said. "The earnout structure is tied to retention metrics I'm already hitting, so the total number is likely to land near the top of the range. I haven't decided yet." $4.7 million, he said. His voice was quieter now. "Starting figure," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and I will give him credit for this because it took something to say it, I didn't know. No, I said. You didn't. I picked up the term sheet and folded it back into thirds. About the director role, I said. I appreciate you putting my name in. You can let your HR director know I won't be submitting. I have a conflict of interest situation that makes it awkward, and besides, we're in the middle of a transaction. I tucked the page back into my jacket pocket. Congratulations again on the engagement. Sophia is wonderful. He nodded. He did not say anything else before I moved down the bar to find my cousin. Sophia found me 20 minutes later, near the end of the table where the bread had just arrived. She had seen something in Diego's face when she came in, and she had the particular attentiveness of a person who has known someone their whole life and can read small changes in the weather. What happened? She asked. I showed him the term sheet, I said. She looked at me for a moment. The acquisition? He offered to get my name in the door at his company, I said. It felt like the right time. Sophia was quiet. Then she said, he's going to feel terrible. He'll be fine, I said. He's a resilient person. I tore a piece of bread. How are you? Tonight is yours. She let it go for the moment because it was her party and she was generous enough to let it be that, and the dinner was good and the table was loud and my Uncle Bernardo made a toast that was sincere and slightly too long and everyone laughed. I sat beside my father, who had heard nothing of what had happened at the bar, and he put his hand on my shoulder at one point and said, quietly, you look like you're carrying something good tonight, Mija. I told him I'd explain later. Later came 3 days afterward on a Tuesday evening when Sophia called me. Diego had told her what had happened. She wanted to hear my version. I told her the shape of it, not to prosecute Diego but because Sophia deserved the actual account. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her best qualities. When I finished, she said, he told me he felt stupid. He didn't have the information, I said. He made the assessment he could make from what he could see. You could have told him sooner. I could have, I said. But Sophia, I told this family what I was building for 6 years. I answered the questions every time someone asked. I didn't hide anything. At some point the information is available and people choose what to do with it. She was quiet for a moment. He said to you that you'd never get into a role like that on your own, she said. At the Easter dinner. At the cookout. He kept saying things like that. Yes, I said. I heard some of it, she said. I should have said something. It's not your job to manage him, I said. No, she said. But it's my job to manage what I allow at my family's table. The following Sunday, Sophia brought Diego to my parents' house for dinner. He had asked to come. He shook my father's hand and helped carry things from the kitchen, and at the end of the meal, when the table had cleared to just the 4 of us, Sophia, Diego, my parents, me, he looked at me and said, with the directness of someone who had rehearsed this and decided to say it plainly anyway, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your work that were wrong, and I said them out loud in front of your family more than once. I'm sorry. I looked at him across the table. You said I told him that Rome wasn't built in a day. You said that to my mother's question about my business at this table 18 months into my company's operation. I kept my voice even. I had placed 107 people into jobs by that point. What you meant as patience was a ceiling you had put on what you thought was possible for me. He nodded. He didn't look away. You said I'd probably never get into something like the director role on my own, I said. What I was doing at that moment was preparing a business presentation for a firm that had been watching my retention metrics for a year and a half. They weren't interested in my institutional backing. They were interested in the methodology I built in a spare bedroom. I know that now, he said. And when you told Andres they'd never let in someone without the background, I said, I had just returned from closing a $400,000 annual retainer. The background was there. It just didn't look like what you expected background to look like. I picked up my coffee cup and held it with both hands. I accept the apology, I said. And I want you to understand, none of this was about you. I wasn't waiting for a moment. I just had work to do and I did it, and eventually the work became visible. That's the whole story. Diego nodded again slowly. My father was looking at his plate with the quiet expression he wore when something had been said that he had been waiting years to hear said. My mother refilled everyone's coffee without being asked. I did not take the Farrow Kinsley acquisition. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the story. I went back to Sandra Okafor 2 weeks after the engagement party and told her that after reviewing the earnout structure and the integration timeline, I did not believe the 3-year lock-in served the candidates in my pipeline or the clients who had built their hiring processes around the Reyes assessment. I told her I would rather grow the firm independently for another cycle and revisit in 2 years with stronger data. She said she respected the decision and hoped we would stay in conversation. I told her we would. That conversation was one of the easier ones I have had in my professional life, which tells me something about how far I had come from the folding table and the parking structure window. What I think about now is not Diego. He became a reasonable person once the information was level, which is what usually happens with people who were never actually cruel, just incurious. He and Sophia married the following spring. He shook my hand at the reception with both of his and said your toast was the best one, and I think he meant it. We are not close, but we are fine, and fine is what I was hoping for. What I think about is my father. I think about him sitting at that Sunday dinner table, hand on my shoulder, saying you look like you're carrying something good. He did not know about the term sheet. He did not know about Chicago or Sandra Okafor or the 4.7 million or any of it. He just knew me well enough to read the particular way I was sitting in my chair that night, and he said the right thing without any information at all. That is the thing about the people who actually see you, they don't need the documentation. They have been watching you long enough to know the difference between someone who is pretending to be fine and someone who is quietly certain. I built Reyes Meridian Staffing Solutions for a lot of reasons. I built it because I watched my father get passed over in rooms that should have wanted him. I built it because I had a methodology that I believed worked and no institution was going to let me use it the way it needed to be used. I built it because I needed to know whether I could. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I also built it because there is a specific satisfaction in doing a thing well, quietly for years, and then one day setting the evidence on a bar in front of someone who told you it couldn't be done. Not for them. The satisfaction is not for them, that's the part that took me a while to understand. The work was never about proving Diego Fuentes wrong. The work was about being right. Those are different things. One of them requires an audience and the other one doesn't, and the one that doesn't is the one that lasts. If this story found you at a moment when someone in your life has a version of you in their head that is years behind who you actually are, share it with someone who needs to hear that the work is the answer. Not the confrontation. The work. This is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes. All characters, names, events, and circumstances depicted are entirely imaginary and do not represent any real individuals or situations.